I was standing in my kitchen holding a phone that was ringing with a number I didn't recognize. 7 years, 80 to 4 months, every single one of them, $5,000 had landed in my account from a person I had never met and could never trace. I had stopped asking questions a long time ago. I had built an entire quiet life around that silence, but the woman on the other end of that call wasn't asking me anything. She was telling me something. $27 million had just been deposited into my account, and the man who sent it had left me a message. A message that started with the words, "She won't remember me, but I never forgot her." I sat down right there on the kitchen floor because my legs simply stopped agreeing to hold me up. And I want to tell you exactly how I got there, because none of it makes sense until you understand where it started. My name is Maren Ellison. I was 39 years old, divorced, and working as a part-time bookkeeper for a physical therapy clinic in Dayton, Ohio. My son Owen was 11. My daughter Piper was 8. Their father Todd had moved to Austin with a woman named Sabine who did hot yoga and never once, not one single time, asked me how the kids were sleeping at night. His child support checks arrived the way rain arrives during a drought, occasionally, unpredictably, and never quite enough to matter. I wasn't a woman who got lucky. Lucky women didn't count out exact change at the pharmacy while the line behind them sighed and shifted their weight. Lucky women didn't lie awake at 2 in the morning doing math on their fingers under a blanket so the light from their phone wouldn't wake the kids. I owned a small house with a roof that leaked every spring along the same stubborn seam, and a car that made a grinding sound whenever I braked too hard, a sound I'd been ignoring since the previous winter because the estimate to fix it was $400 I did not have. That was my life in the fall of 2016. Nothing dramatic about it. Nothing anyone would write a story about. Just the specific bone-deep tiredness of a woman who had been carrying everything alone for so long that she'd forgotten what it felt like to set something down, even for an afternoon. I was sitting at my kitchen table on a gray Tuesday evening, the kind that smells like wet leaves and unpaid bills, when my phone buzzed with a deposit notification. I assumed it was my paycheck from the clinic, arriving 2 days late as usual. I picked it up, without any real urgency. Then I saw the number on the screen and set my coffee mug down slowly. Deposit received, $5,000. Sender, private wire transfer, no name attached, no memo, nothing. I called the bank's after-hours line immediately, certain there had been some kind of error. The representative confirmed the deposit was real, that it had already cleared, and that the sender had specifically requested to remain anonymous, and that under the terms of the transfer, the bank was legally obligated to honor that request. "But someone just sent me $5,000, I said, hearing how absurd the sentence sounded even as it left my mouth. "Yes, ma'am," she said. "That's correct." For 3 days I waited for someone to call and tell me it had been a mistake, that the money would be clawed back, that a stranger somewhere was frantically trying to undo a clerical error. Nobody called. The money sat there, still and quiet, like something I hadn't earned the right to touch. So eventually, I used it. I paid down 2 months of mortgage in advance, something I had never once done in my adult life. I bought Owen a coat that actually fit him. I let myself breathe, just slightly, for what felt like the first time in years. But I had absolutely no idea how strange and how enormous this was about to become. The deposits kept coming, exactly on the 14th of every month, with the same anonymous reference code and the same total silence around it. By the 2nd year, I had stopped calling the bank to ask questions nobody could answer. By the 5th year, $5,000 on the 14th had become the single most reliable thing in my entire life. More reliable than my ex-husband, more reliable than my car, more reliable than the weather. I told almost no one, not my mother in Columbus, not my sister Renee, who would have called the FBI, the IRS, and probably a psychic hotline out of pure principle. I kept it to myself and I used the money with something close to reverence. The roof finally got fixed in 2019. Piper's braces were paid in full. A small college account quietly grew in the background of our ordinary life. Then, on a Tuesday morning in March, 7 years after that first notification, my phone rang with a number I didn't recognize. First National, priority customer line. I had never once received a call from that line before. "Ms. Ellison, the woman said, her voice formal and careful. "This is Diane Marsh calling from First National. I'm calling because an extraordinary transfer was made to your account this morning. The amount is $27 million. She paused, and I could hear her take a breath before continuing. The sender left a message. He said you would want to know who he was. I gripped the edge of the counter so hard my knuckles went white. Who is he? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper, already knowing somehow that my life had just split into a before and an after. His name, she said gently, was Harold Weiss. He passed away 3 days ago. I had never heard that name in my entire life. Are you sure this isn't a mistake? I asked, gripping the phone so tightly my fingers ached. People don't do this. Strangers don't leave $27 million to someone they've never spoken to. I understand this is a great deal to absorb, Diane said carefully. But the transfer has already cleared. The estate's attorneys will be contacting you directly within the next few days. I asked her to repeat the name twice, as if saying it enough times might jar loose some memory I didn't know I had. It never did. Harold Weiss remained to me a total stranger, the way he had been for 12 years, and the way, apparently, I had never been to him. That was the exact moment the mystery I had quietly carried for 7 years cracked wide open. Because a complete stranger had given me $420,000 over the better part of a decade, and now he was gone. And what he'd left behind wasn't just a fortune. It felt like a door swinging open onto something I wasn't sure I was ready to see. That night, sitting alone at my kitchen table with the message still echoing in my head, I made a decision that would change absolutely everything that came after. I couldn't sleep. At 3 a.m, I sat at my kitchen table with my laptop open, searching a name that had meant nothing to me 12 hours earlier and somehow explained the entire shape of my adult life. Harold Weiss, founder of a regional hardware chain with locations across 3 states, sold years earlier for a sum the business press described only as substantial. A widower. No listed children in most of the coverage, until I dug deeper and found 2. A daughter, Claudia Weiss Harmon, and a son, Preston Weiss, both grown. Both apparently estranged from him for the better part of a decade, according to one old and half-forgotten newspaper profile. The message the bank had read to me kept looping through my head on repeat. 12 years earlier, on a freezing February night outside his own hardware store, I had sat beside a stranger on a concrete step for 11 minutes. I had given him coffee and half of my sandwich because he looked like a man who had forgotten what it felt like to be seen by anyone. I hadn't thought about him again after that week. He apparently had thought about me every single day since. I cried that night, and it wasn't from joy. It was something heavier and harder to name. Grief for a man I could barely picture kneeling beside. Fear of a fortune I hadn't earned and didn't fully understand. And underneath both of those feelings, something colder was starting to settle in. A quiet, uncomfortable certainty that a man that wealthy doesn't leave everything to a stranger unless the people closest to him gave him a devastating reason to. You have to understand what that felt like. To grieve a man you'd met once, while simultaneously bracing for a war with people you'd never met at all. I sat with my head in my hands for a long time. I thought about Owen and Piper asleep down the hall, blissfully unaware that their mother's whole life had just tilted sideways. I realized then, sitting alone in that quiet kitchen, that no one was coming to explain any of this to me, or to protect me from whatever came next. I had to save myself, and I had to do it carefully. The next morning, I called an estate attorney named Renata Cole, recommended by a friend who had survived her own brutal legal battle years earlier. I sat across from her in a small office on a Friday afternoon and laid out everything. The 7 years of anonymous deposits, the phone call from the bank, Harold's final message, the 2 estranged children I had never once met. She listened without interrupting, made 3 careful notes on a legal pad, then took off her glasses and looked at me directly. "The will is airtight," she said. 2 witnesses, a notary, full documentation of his mental competency at the time of signing. A contest based on capacity will fail, she paused. but airtight doesn't mean uncontested. They will fight this. Not because they think they'll win, because litigation is expensive and exhausting, and they're likely betting that you'll settle just to make it stop. I won't, I told her. She nodded, like she'd expected exactly that answer, and wrote something else on the pad. Within the week, she had filed a formal response establishing my legal claim, and she began quietly building my case, brick by brick, week by week, quietly, methodically. She pulled Harold's medical and estate records. She documented a precise timeline. She hired an investigator to look into the Weiss siblings' financial history, just as a standard precaution in contested estate matters. On the surface, I kept living an ordinary life. School drop-offs, grocery runs, bookkeeping on Tuesdays and Thursdays, because I had learned that routine was the only thing keeping me steady. Underneath that surface, though, Renata was quietly assembling a wall of documented fact that no accusation would be able to get through. There was a small win early on, too. The investigator found something in the Weiss siblings' history that Renata said would matter enormously later, though she wouldn't tell me exactly what yet. They had absolutely no idea what was coming for them. The contest hearing was scheduled for the second week of June, in a small fluorescent-lit courtroom that looked nothing like the ones on television. Claudia and Preston sat at the opposing table beside their attorney, both dressed like people who had rehearsed exactly how to look wronged. I sat beside Renata in a plain gray blazer, my hands folded tightly in my lap to keep them from shaking. Their attorney called Preston to the stand first, to testify that Harold had been mentally compromised in his final years. Renata rose and approached the stand with her legal pad in hand, her voice level and unhurried. "When did you last visit your father in person?" she asked. A pause. "We spoke on the phone regularly." "When did you last visit him in person?" she repeated. Another pause, longer this time. "Around 8 years ago, approximately." 8 years, Renata said, letting the number sit in the room. "During that same period, you and your sister petitioned a court to have your father declared mentally incompetent. That petition was denied. 3 separate independent psychiatric evaluations found him fully competent. Evaluations conducted after your petition failed. And yet you're here today, claiming authority over decisions in a life you were not present for. Help me understand that." The courtroom went completely silent. I counted the seconds without meaning to. 7 full seconds of nothing but the low hum of the fluorescent lights overhead. Claudia stared down at the table in front of her. Preston looked over at his sister, and his sister looked at absolutely no one at all. That was the moment I had waited 7 years for without even knowing I was waiting for it. Claudia leaned over and whispered something to their attorney, who stood and requested a brief recess. The judge denied it. "We'll continue," she said, and for the first time all morning, I watched Claudia's composed expression crack at the edges, just slightly, just enough for me to see it. The judge ruled in just 12 minutes, calling Harold's competency extensive, consistent, and unimpeachable. The contest was dismissed in its entirety. In a final note, the judge referred a last-minute, unsubstantiated evidence motion filed by the Weiss siblings' attorney to the state bar for disciplinary review. Renata later told me that kind of decisiveness was rare in a contested estate case. Most rulings, she said, took weeks to be delivered in writing. This one came from the bench, in real time, with both siblings still sitting at the table watching it happen. $27 million money that had started impossibly as 11 forgettable minutes on a cold concrete step was legally, finally, and completely mine. I sat there in that gray blazer with my hands pressed flat against the table to keep them steady, thinking about a stranger's voice reading me a message that had waited 12 patient years to finally be delivered. I didn't change much, not right away. For 30 days after the ruling, I kept doing the school runs and the bookkeeping shifts, because I had learned across 7 strange years that money changes the conditions of a life, but never its center. Then, slowly and deliberately, I began to build something with it. I set up trusts for Owen and Piper, structured carefully so the money would help them, without ever defining them. I funded a scholarship for single parents returning to school, exactly the kind of quiet lifeline that would have changed everything for me a decade earlier. I bought a modest house with a porch that didn't leak. I started volunteering downtown twice a week, on the same kind of sidewalks where I had once sat with a grieving stranger for 11 minutes and never thought about it again. Because now, finally, I understood in a way I never had before exactly what it costs a person to feel completely invisible, and exactly what it's worth to be the one person who stops. I never got an apology from Harold's children. I never needed one, and I stopped waiting for it somewhere along the way. Some doors close so quietly you don't even hear the latch click. You just notice, one ordinary morning, that the room on the other side is finally entirely yours.